I also had an opportunity to have a debate publicly with Don Johanson, the famous archaeologist who discovered Lucy. He's an anthropologist, the so-called missing link. And, he shows this all over the world, this little skull with a protruding mandible and a receding forehead. And I said, I'm a neurosurgeon. And I operate on a lot of people who have, deformed skulls and things. And, eventually they die and they get buried. And years later, somebody like you comes along and finds their skull and said they found a missing link, He didn't appreciate that. But I said, why is there just one of them? Why isn't there a whole colony of them? How can you dig up this one little thing and then extrapolate? And that's what those who are creationists tend to do, make these gigantic extrapolations without real evidence of what's going on.
And man and the apes are end products of an evolutionary process. This comes from textbooks, which shows you that here there is no evidence. The only evidence we have is at that level, and any creature that is buried with them in the past. So all the fossils that we have, and this is very important that you realize this, all the fossils that exist occur together with man at the same time. Are you with me? Nowhere do you find layers of the one and then the other and the other and the other. That's based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossil. So it's just like giving you all the bones of the dogs and saying arrange them. So we find all these bones, including man, in the same layers, and we say, okay, scientists, put them out like they evolved. But they were all there at the same time. So the Australopithecines and the so-called hominid fossils and modern man all existed at the same time. So we have what we call a morphological sequence, not a paleontological sequence. It's not how it happened in the rocks, it's how we think it happened from all the bones that we have. Are you with me? Very important difference. So now, if you look at these monkeys and you look at this man, they all live at the same time, but somehow they hope that the one retained features of something more primitive than the other. Here again, everything happened down there. Everything exists at the same time. Our living relatives. Those are our relatives, but our ancestors, we don't know what they were like. We have no idea. Primate ancestors. Well, we have 98% of genes in common with a chimpanzee, so we must be very much related, correct? Is that what they tell you? Absolutely. 2% difference. These are structural genes. You know how huge 2% difference is? It's enormous difference. Because the way in which we developed is not necessarily depicted by the genes, but by the expression of the genes. How they are expressed, and that's determined by controlling genes and not by structural genes at all. So you can get this very similar genes giving totally different structures. And by the way, we have just about as many genes in common with a mouse. And do you know that we have 76% of genes in common with a banana? So did we evolve from the banana? Did we? You see, don't be impressed by figures like 98%. It means absolutely nothing. It's actually scientific skullduggery. It is dishonest to say that in the least. Science says that all of this is fair and well, but there's a problem. Surely it would take millions of years for these layers to form solid rock. Well, here's something interesting. We have a ceramic pot over here, and a bottle encased in solid stone, and they come from the HMS Birkenhead, which sank off Danger Point in 1852. So basically, you have two choices. Either this bottle is millions of years old, or this rock is not millions of years old. Now, we know how old it is, so we know it must have formed rapidly. Here you have a bell, that's a ship's bell, encased in solid rock. So you have to now either believe that the bell is millions of years old, or that the rock is not millions of years old. Stalactites and stalagmites. Who's been to a cave, a big cave somewhere in the States? What do they tell you? How old are these stalactites and stalagmites? They tell you they are millions of years old. Is that correct? Okay. Here's one that formed when water was pumped to this area, and it grew in front of their eyes because the water was rich in calcium carbonate, and here it formed. Here is one, or many of them, where you see two people standing down there. Those are miners. This is a mine that has been vacated for some 30 years, and these are the stalagmites and stalactites in this mine. So now you have to assume that this mine is millions of years old, or that these did not take so long to form. Which is it going to be? We know that this is a mine, and that this took 30 years, and that is what you see. In fact, I have a bridge that I travel under when I go to work in my home country. And under this bridge, there hangs this beautiful stalactite about so long. Every time I travel under that bridge, I wonder, wow, who constructed this millions of year old bridge over here? So a picture really does speak 1,000 words. There's one last hope, and that is gemstones. Surely they take a long time to form. This is malachite. Malachite is a semi-precious stone which we find in Africa. It's a ritual stone. It's used by the witch doctors, and it has magical connotations for them. It's a beautiful green stone, and it forms in Zaire, the former Congo. And there are mines there where these are dug out. Now, they form in columns like this. So they're basically like stalactites and stalagmites. And they form when the right elements are in the rock. Now, it's very expensive. And here is a piece that was sent to the United States from Africa. And it broke in transit. Now, a piece like this, that's about 12 centimeters across. It's not very big. A piece like this will cost in the region of $26,000 US. This is expensive stuff. So now, when it broke, they sent it back. And now the dealer had it and called me and says, I have a disaster. Come and look at this. So I went and had a look. And there was a wire. Can you see it? Sticking out of the rock. And I said to the dealer, you know, we have a wire in here. This is very, very strange. Do you mind if I take your $26,000 rock and break off the next one? Literally burst into tears. Literally. That's a lot of money, you know. But we took it and we went, and guess what? What do you see in there? Well, let me go a little bit closer. What do you see down there? It's another wire. And if you look at the material, it's malachite. There is no crooking here. This is perfect malachite. So now you have an option. This wire over here tells you that wire has been around for millions and millions of years. Or there's another option. The miners might have discovered that if they put copper wires down and they let water run through the rock material, that this would act as a center for rapid formation, and the stone would form quickly. So I said to the dealer, wow, where do you get this stuff? He said, I got it in Zaire. I said, that's amazing. Can you get any more? He says, no, they're out. I said, well, that's a great opportunity. Phone them. Ask if you can order some more. And he said, but they have none. I said, well, ask how long it'll take before you can get some more. So he found them, and he asked them when he could get some more malachite. And they said they were all out. So he said, well, how long would it take before you could send me another assignment? And they said, well, how big do you want it? That's a fascinating question, don't you think? How big do you want it? What has size got to do with what you find in a mine? And so I said to him, same size. Yeah, same size. So he said, well, about 12 centimeters by 12 centimeters. And they were silent for a while, and they said, we could probably find those in about 3 months. So how long does it take for this rock to form? 3 months. So do we need millions and millions of years for all of these features? The Bible says in Romans 1 verse 20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So basically, if you go and look out there, maybe you can see things which might tell you that maybe the Bible's not so wrong after all. That's the bottom line of this text. But surely it will take millions of years for that tree to turn into stone. Well, here are the amazing stone bears of Yorkshire. There's a little stream in Yorkshire which is high in silicon, which is what you would expect after a universal flood as well. And they come there and they hang their teddy bears in the water. And the time needed for that teddy bear to turn into solid stone depends on the size of the teddy bear. Larger porous items, large teddy bears, clothing, take 6 to 12 months. Non-porous items, such as the top hat of a fireman helmet, can take up to 18 months to be encased in solid stone. There they are, solid stone.
I mean, how many people would look at a computer and look at a computer program and say that it's just random, it just happened? And yet, you take a program like C++ and, a series of zeros and ones can create all kinds of sophisticated commands that a computer can execute. Well, when you look at the genome, you take a series of 4 repeating nucleic acids, which create a template that tells you whether you have a man or a giraffe or an algae or a Drosophila, and what kind of one of those it will be. And it is infinitely more complex than the C++ program for a computer. And that's what Francis Collins recognized as he was becoming the leading authority in this. And it became absolutely clear to him that evolution, in that sense, even if he does believe in a type of evolution, he said it had to have a creator.
So let's have a look at what the probability would be, for example, of a bomb exploding under a pile of wood, going boom, and then falling down from the sky and forming this perfect, functional little house. What would the probability be? Well, the probability is very, very remote. Let's give it a very good probability, or a very poor one. In fact, it's even much worse than this. Let's say the probability is 1 in 10 to the power of 80. Now, what is that? That sounds like a very small figure. 10 to the power of 80 is what physics claims is the number of particles in the entire universe. Particles. That means not only atoms, but subparticles. Electrons, hadrons, quarks, neutrons, protons in the entire universe. How many atoms in a pinhead? Billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions, right? So imagine how many atoms in the entire universe. It sounds mind-boggling, but it's only 10 to the power of 80. It's not a very big number when you look at it, but that is really a mind-boggling number. 10 with 80 zeros behind it. So that would be the probability. What would be the probability of a simple gene coming into existence by chance? Well, there are 3 nucleotides needed to code for one amino acid in a protein. And let's take a simple protein that has 100 amino acids. Your hemoglobin, for example, has 600 amino acids. So let's take a simple protein, 100 amino acids. You need 300 nucleotides in the right sequence. What's the probability of that happening by chance? Well, the probability is 10 to the power of 127. That is, unfortunately, boom! New York City has been established by a nuclear explosion. Do you believe that? You would have to have that kind of faith.
But I think perhaps the most important evidence for the existence of God is what happens in our own lives, our own personal experience with God. There is nothing in any book or any university that compares with your own personal experience. But the real linchpin of evolution is natural selection. And of course, that's a term coined by Charles Darwin. And many people don't know this, but Charles Darwin actually started out in a seminary to become a man of the cloth. He had some experiences with God that didn't go his way, like his 10-year-old daughter who died of pneumonia despite his pleas. But, he goes off to the Galapagos Islands. And he was a very keen observer. I will give him credit. And he noticed some things that you didn't seem to see anyplace else. He particularly noticed the finches there who had these elongated, thickened beaks. And he said, no other finches have beaks like this. This is evidence of evolutionary change. Now, what he didn't know is that there had been severe droughts in the Galapagos for 3 years. The only finches that survived were the ones that had thick beaks that could break open the seedlings and extract the nutrition, and they were able to breed and pass that trait on to the next. But evolutionists say that those changes that you see, just like you saw with all the dogs, is definitive proof of evolution. Now, I submit that changes can occur within a species. But is that a sign of evolution? Or is it a sign of an intelligent creator who gave his creatures the ability to adapt to their environment so that he wouldn't have to start over every 50 years? That sounds much more intelligent than anything else. And no one has ever demonstrated one species changing to another species. And, this should be, if it's true, a continual evolving. So we should be able to find intermediate species at any given point in time. And we should be able to find how they line up.
These genes we call the genotype. And when these genes are expressed, we call that the phenotype. All right, let me explain these terms. It's very important that we understand how science pictures the evolutionary events around the genetic system. The genotype consists of all the genes actually present in a zygote. That's a fertilized egg. So all the genes that I have, that's my genotype. But not all the genes that I have are expressed. So that which is expressed is my phenotype. So if you want to have a look at your phenotype, go and stand in front of a mirror. And you'll see it. That's your phenotype. Now there's a law in evolution which states the following. Natural selection can only operate at the level of the phenotype, never the level of the genotype. You got that? Let me repeat it. natural selection can only operate at the level of the phenotype, never the level of the genotype. Why not? Well, let me illustrate with an example. Two people walk in wherever, in a game park. And let's say there are wild animals around in the game park. And the one person is long and lean, and the other person is short and plump. And now a predator comes from behind the bush and attacks them. A lion, a bear, whatever you would like it to be. And they both take off like greased lightning. Which one is probably going to end up being a meal? The short fat one, right? Okay. So short fat was the what? The phenotype. That's right. Short fat phenotype hasn't got a snowball's hope in hell against the lean mean phenotype. So by natural selection, short fat goes, long lean mean stays. Is that correct? That's how it works. The animal is not concerned with all the other information in your genes. It's just interested in how you look and how fast you run. Is that correct? That's it. So natural selection does not work at the level of the genotype. So what does work at the level of the genotype? How are genes changed over time? Not by natural selection, but by mutations. That's right. And how do mutations take place? They are random. They take place by chance. And once they are expressed in the phenotype, then they can be selected for. Does that make sense? Now remember, Charles Darwin didn't know anything about this. Let me simplify this for you so that everybody can understand this. Now, I know that I'm speaking to some who have biological training and some who have no biological training. So I'm trying here to target all of you. So if I shoot over your heads tonight, there will be plenty that you can take home with at the end of the day in spite of that. If I shoot too low for your liking, then please tolerate that, because there are people here that would otherwise take nothing home with them. Is that fair? Good. So let's sum up. This is your genotype. That's the information in your genes, in your DNA. The phenotype is what you look like. That's what we said. Natural selection operates at the level of the phenotype. It doesn't operate at that level. That's where chance operates. Chance through mutations. Fine. Let's put that into another model. Here we have a book of instructions on how to build an aeroplane. Okay? Here's a book of instructions with detailed instructions on how to build an aeroplane. The book of instructions in our analogy is what? The genotype. The DNA is a book of instructions on how to build a human being. Isn't that correct? All right. And the phenotype is the actual aeroplane. Now, question. Who wrote the book? Well, who wrote the book? Obviously, some intelligent designer wrote the book in this case, right? Correct? But in our analogy, who wrote the book? Chance. Or as you guys say it, chance. I can say it. Chance wrote the book, just so that you have another accent to contend with. All right, Chance wrote the book. That's incredible. With all the information as to how to build the airplane. Now that's fascinating. That is really monstrous. That's terrific. Let's play this game out. I have a book. Here it is. And let's assume, for argument's sake, that this book has now come into existence by chance. mutations. And all the information for whatever it is we're going to build is in here. In this case, all the information for my aeroplane has now by chance appeared, and here it is in this book. This is great. So now I'm going to take this book, and I'm going to put it down over here on the floor. There it is. It's in my bookshelf. There it is. And now I'm going to wait for the aeroplane to appear. After all, I have all the information. It has come about by chance. There it is. And it's all there. Now, all that has to happen is the aeroplane must come. How long am I going to wait? How long am I going to wait? Well, come on. Forever. I'm going to wait forever and ever and ever. Is it enough for the information to come into existence by itself? Yes or no? No. If I don't have a mechanism that will translate this information into the aeroplane, then my aeroplane will never appear. Is that correct or not? Okay. So my book by itself, even if it should come into existence by chance, is totally what? Useless. Thank you. Okay. Now that we've solved that problem, let's think about that. All right. So my book is really useless without a method of transcribing the information into the aeroplane. Now, what do I need to change the information into an aeroplane? You tell me. Well, I need some factory, don't I? And I need someone to intelligently interpret what is in that book so that I can get the aeroplane constructed. So I need some assembly line, and I need some workers. Or if I don't have workers, what do I need? I need tools and machines, robots, if you like, that will do it for me. Is that correct? So, question. Where or how did the design mechanisms get translated? How did the factory come into existence? And how did the robots come into existence that will eventually build my machine so that I can test fly it? According to my analogy, natural selection will only start operating when once what has happened? The aeroplane's there. So the whole mechanism to convert the information into the aeroplane, how did that have to come into existence? You tell me. You have two choices. Two choices. Because natural selection will only work once the aeroplane is there. Then I can only see, oh, it flies or it does not fly, right? So how did the mechanism come into existence? Give me the choices. The first one is chance. The second one is design. Design. That's your only possibility. Either it's chance or it is creative design. Those are the only two possibilities that we have. Okay, which one does science choose? Chance. Science chooses chance. Good.
But, you know, the interesting thing about evolution, about natural selection, is that it claims that anything that isn't useful disappears. So while a species is in the process of changing, it clings on to those things that allow it to thrive, and those things that are not useful disappear. So if that's the case, why do we have kidneys? Because kidney has many components. You know, the glomerulus and renal tubules and all kinds of epithelial surfaces, all of which work together to be able to filter blood, create urine. It's a complex process. None of those things in and of themselves have any purpose. Same thing with your eye. You have an iris and a pupil and a cornea and vitreous, and, retina, rod cells, and cone cells, all of which are necessary for the eye to function. Short ciliary nerves. Now, without the other parts, it doesn't work. So how did it get there? Did a cone cell, which is sophisticated in and of itself, just kind of sit around for a few million years waiting for a rod cell? And then they sit around waiting for a retinal network? According to the theory, it had to go and there was an eyeball overnight, just like that, because it wouldn't work in any other way. And when you ask the evolutionists about that, they say, well, we don't understand everything. And I say, well, I don't think you understand anything. Because then you go to the brain. I mean, the human brain, the most sophisticated organ system in the universe. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers every single thing you have ever seen. Every single thing you have ever heard. Can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. I mean, it is unbelievable. Some people say, well, you shouldn't learn this, you shouldn't learn this because you'll overload your brain. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Now, what a bunch of nonsense that is. Do you know your brain, and this is a conservative estimate, could take in one new fact every second for over 3 million years before you begin to challenge its capacity. So don't let anybody tell you that you can overload your brain. And that's our brains in their degenerated state. Can you imagine what they were like before? Unbelievable. Because we're made in the image of God.
Now, imagine now the first little cell comes into existence. Just by chance. Highly improbable. The molecules, well, they would not have come into existence by chance under the different circumstances. Even if they did, would they form life? Highly improbable. You'd have to imagine boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, thousands of times over. And you'd really have to believe that because chance or design is your only option at that level. And then, let's say, fortuitously, besides all that, a cell appeared. Now you have one cell. Now, of how many cells do we consist of? Thousands. And they're all different. So now, how do you account a unicellular little creature through evolution eventually giving rise to a multicellular organism? Well, a chap by the name of Haeckel came along and said, German scientist, that's not so difficult. What happened is the following. One cell came, and when it divided, that's another kettle of fish. How did it divide? But let's leave it at that. It divided, and the cells stuck together. And eventually it formed the ball of cells, and eventually this structure, because the ball, when it moved along, how did it move along? How did it get the structures to move along? That's another kettle of fish. Let's leave that up. And let's say it developed a dent, and eventually this dent was like this, and eventually the dent went all the way through, and then you have the basic body plan of every single living organism that is multicellular. Like we, for example. We look like this with a dent all the way through. We have a tube going all the way through, right? The one opening is where? There, and the other one, you can imagine. So that's the basic body plan. Now, think about this. If a cell divides and it has genetic information and it sticks together, then both cells will have the same genetic information, right or wrong. And if it divides again, it'll still have the same genetic information. And if it divides and makes a ball, they'll all have the same genetic information. And no matter how many times you divide it, it'll have the same genetic information. Haeckel says, we can see in the evolution of animals that this happened because the embryos of the various animals look the same. Of course, they don't tell you that he really cheated in this process tremendously and was even reprimanded at the highest level because of this. And how do you account then for this amazing feat of a mutation changing cells? Now, I can assume that a mutation can change the shape of a cell into something else. Let's say that's possible, but that's not what we want. We want to develop different cells. So, for example, let's take two. A muscle cell and a nerve cell. Two very different cells. Did they exist in the beginning, yes or no? Let's say fortuitously a little blob of protoplasm started to go bloop, 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 bloop in the ocean. Would there have been a muscle cell and a nerve cell, yes or no? No, that would have been some later innovation, right? So, how did the muscle cell and the nerve cell get its genetic information? You see, a muscle cell must have genes which say you are a muscle cell. And a nerve cell must have genes which say you are a nerve cell. Does that make sense? Okay? But none of these existed in the beginning. But let's say that the first cell looked something like this. That could account for this shape, but it couldn't account for the next shape. Where did that new shape come from? So what we actually need is we need a new gene which says, hello, you are now a nerve cell. Does that make sense? But that's not enough. If I had a nerve cell in my body and I had a muscle cell here in my arm, what would it help me if the two never talked to each other? Would it help me? No. Would it help me if I had muscle cells and nerve cells all jumbled up in my body, yes or no? Of course not. Where do I want my nerve cells? Well, I want them in the right place. For example, it would be very useful if you want to study to have them all up here, isn't that right? And if you wanted to pick something up, to do it up with a brain cell, pick it up with a brain cell would be pretty useless. So you want your muscle cells down here, right? Okay, so how do I tell the cell the genes for muscle must be switched on here and the genes for brain must be switched on over there? How do I tell my brain that or my muscle that? Well, I need a switch. I need a switch. If I have two lights, one over there and one over there, and I want that one on and that one off, or that one on and that one off, how many switches must I have at the back? Two. That's right. So now I need a switch because I've got two cells. But the original cells didn't have two kinds of cells, so they didn't need the switches. So now I have a question. Where does the extra gene come from? That's genotype. How did it come into existence? You have two choices. Chance or design. So, boom, little house. Where did the switch come from? In fact, you need two switches. Where did they come from? Boom, little house, boom, little house. That's where they came from. That's what you have to believe. There's no other choice whatsoever. And this highly complex mechanism for switching on genes and switching off genes had to come about by chance or design. But that's not enough. You need a gene which says you look like this. You need a gene which says you look like that. That's two genes. You need a gene which says you're switched on. That's another two genes. Those are the switches. That's not enough. You also need genes to control the physiology so that this one will function differently to that one. And you need genes controlling the embryology so that they will work together. Hello, where do those genes come from? It's genotype. Natural selection doesn't work there until this thing actually works. Boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house. For a week you have to say that. You need one heck of a lot of faith for that.
You know, people try to disparage the Bible, say that these things are not true, these are fanciful tales. And yet, there's abundant evidence, geological evidence, that there was a worldwide flood. Go up to the Andes Mountains and see all those fossils on the top of those mountains. I mean, these things, when you talk to the evolutionists about them, they always say the same thing. Well, we don't understand everything. And I just say, I'm not sure you understand anything. You know, they look at all those layers And then they find some fossils in one of the layers, and they says, this fossil is this many years old because it's in this layer. So that means this fossil is like 1 million years old. And then later on they say, well, this layer is 1 million years old because this fossil, which is 1 million years old, is in it. You know, that's like saying, you know, the sky can be red or blue. And you say, well, the sky is blue. And you say, why is it blue? Because it's not red. Well, why is it not red? Because it's blue. You know, that's known as circular reasoning. That's how they explain the age of all these things. It's very circular reasoning, and really it has no real scientific validity.
Now, first I want to tell you something about a basin. A basin is something like a hollow that can hold water. That's a basin. So here's a kid sitting in a basin. Now, if you have a continent has basins, and a continent has areas where water flows in a particular direction towards the ocean. So in the United States of America, for example, there are these basins, and the water will flow from all the directions into the basins. Plus, there will be flow directions out towards the ocean. And that is a typical modern scenario. So, if we have a look at the general appearance today, here on the one side, the water will be flowing, generally speaking, towards the coast. There will be basins in the center, basins where water flows from all directions into the basins, and then you'll have flow directions to the oceans, etc., on the other sides. And then you can have, between all of them, you can have rivers flowing towards the oceans. That's a typical modern world. And that's what any world should have looked like if the conditions were roughly similar in the past. Is that correct? Okay. Do we have that? The answer is no. If we go to the Paleozoic, that's at the bottom, the lowest layer, we find this very interesting phenomenon. Instead of having basins, there are none. From all the measurements that have been made, it appears that the water flowed in this direction. In other words, generally speaking, from the one side here, from the east coast, generally to the southwest, right across the continent. If you go to the next layer, the Mesozoic, what do you find? The total reverse. Suddenly, things are going in the opposite direction. If you look at the somewhat higher layers, the tertiary, we seem to find somewhat different patterns, some going this way, some going that way, some going this way. So there seems to be some form of restoration taking place. A little bit higher, we seem to have some going this way, some going that way, others going that way, and still higher, we seem to have some reversals. So what do we find? Summary. Precambrian. North America paleocurrents are variable across the craton, show no distinctive continent-wide pattern. So right down at the bottom, it's the same as what you would expect today. So maybe the Precambrian was once the surface of the Earth. That's consistent. The Paleozoic, suddenly you show patterns that are continent-wide and typically flow towards the west and southwest across the continent. That's impossible. You cannot have water flowing from one side of the United States all the way across to the other side, and Canada and everything else. And then in the next time, all the way in the opposite direction. In the Mesozoic, exactly the opposite. It goes from the west to the east, and then in the Cenozoic, there seems to be some continued pattern of the Cretaceous, Paleozoic, but become variable, so they start becoming normal again. So what happened here in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic is inexplicable. These trends are not expected in the standard model of geology. The trends reveal processes that were much larger than anything that you see today, and they are consistent with the global flood. Now let's go to South America. What would you expect in the Precambrian and in the Paleozoic? Precambrian, you have basins, you have all these strange things, not many measurements around. If you go a little bit higher, suddenly, boom, The water flowed right across the continent. Can it do that today? No. What happens here today? What's there? A huge mountain range. There's no way that the water can flow from one side right across to the other side, exactly as in North America. Wow! Water flowed right across North and South America in one direction in the Paleozoic. And in the Mesozoic, exactly in the opposite direction. Is this possible? No. Only with a universal flood would this be possible. If you come up higher, then you start getting variability again, as you would expect. So summary, if you read it through, exactly the same pattern as you have in North America. This is unbelievable. Conclusion, supercontinental trends are not expected in the standard model of conventional basinal geology. Cannot be there. There's no explanation forthcoming for what we can see in these things. So these trends are consistent with a predicted by a catastrophic global model. It's the only thing that can explain it. If you put all the continents together, you have a universal pattern. So the sediments seem to have come here from the center, and the flow directions were universal. So this is an amazing story which seems to tell us that there was a universal flood after all. And if we look at modern fish like the sturgeon, that has heavy bony scales. So what do they say about the sturgeon? That's a primitive fish. That's a very old primitive fish. Why? Because it looks old and primitive. They do exactly the same with a rhino. A rhino looks kind of folded and ancient, doesn't it? And we look at it and say, well, that's a pretty ancient animal. It must have an ancient origin. But in actual fact, it's a mammal. Hello, when did the mammals appear? In recent times, even according to evolutionary theory. So we cannot have our mindset dictate data. You have to take it for what it is. Here is a modern fish with bony scales, and it is not ancient, it's living today. This is the sturgeon. That's the one you get your caviar from if you're into that sort of thing. Then we find fossil beds just covered in scales. Nothing like that happens today. The scales dissolve in the sea after a while. You can go digging in the bottom of the sea. You won't find piles of scales that could fossilize. Doesn't exist. So this is catastrophism. It's much like the bark that was stripped off trees when they rolled in the water and get buried as bark layers, which doesn't make any sense if you don't have a catastrophe. Here are some interesting features. Fish, small, large, buried together, and sometimes you have fossils where a fish is actually eating another fish while it is being fossilized. So what was happening here? Obviously, during this event, this fish was swimming around, took a bite, and before it could say Jack Robinson, what happened? It got buried. It was gone. That's exactly what happened. This is catastrophism. And this fossil over here, this is a fish that is absolutely perfect. You can even see the little ripple marks around it. This fish was literally buried alive instantly because the preservation is perfect. The oxygen was cut off instantly. Science will tell us that we don't have a complete record of the fossil record because soft-bodied creatures don't fossilize readily. That's not true. There are millions of fossils of soft-bodied creatures. Here's one. This is a jellyfish. You can see it's perfectly preserved. We have all kinds of creatures, soft-bodied and non-soft-bodied, perfectly preserved in the fossil record. There is no reason to say that they don't occur in the fossil record because they would not fossilize readily.
You know, Darwin said his whole theory depended on the fossil remains. And he said we should be able to line up from a single cell organism to man, several miles long, and just walk right down the fossil trail and see how everything evolved. And he said the only reason they didn't have the fossils is because they were not geologically sophisticated enough, but that we would be in 50 to 100 years. Well, that was 150 years ago. We still haven't found them. Where are they? Where are the fossil remains? But when you ask the evolutionists about that, they say, I don't know where they are. They're somewhere. We just haven't found them yet. You know, that's a pretty lame excuse, to be honest with you.
This is Johansen. He's the one who found the famous Lucy. And he says, well, she is the prime candidate. Lucy was tiny, and there are scientists today in the literature which say Lucy was nothing other than a pygmy chimp, because she was 100% ape. But how do they depict Lucy in the museums? This is the Museum of Natural History in London. Notice the footprints again. Lucy walking there with a child on her. Is Lucy more closely related to humans than other Australopithecines? Notice it's just an ape. This question is still, what does it say there? Today in the museum, where the greatest paleontological scientists in the world today reside. This question is what? Still unanswered. Partly because each kind of Australopithecine has unique features that could link it with human beings. Of course, they were contemporaneous with human beings. Human beings were already there, so this is no evidence of evolution. These were just apes. Did they walk upright? No evidence whatsoever. Oh no, but they show them gathering sticks and making things and doing all of this from what? That skeleton? That's what they've got. Now the head is 100% ape. The arm to leg ratio, they say, is midway between a human and an ape. You see, apes have a leg to arm ratio of about 1:1. That means the leg is as long as the arm. And humans have a leg to arm ratio of 1 to 0.75. So the arm is only 3/4 as long as the leg. Now that is the average ratio. Now Johansen worked this out and said the ratio here is 1 to 0.87. That's sort of halfway between apes and man. Hello? There are pieces missing there, pieces missing there, pieces missing there, pieces missing there, all over the place. How does he work that out? How does he work that out? But he says that's not the only evidence, so let's forget it. By the way, Johansen is has a big problem, especially with me. Have you seen my arm? It's very, very long. So I must be some intermediate hominid. Some people just have long arms. I can't help it. But it's good to keep trouble at arm's length. Now, he also says this hip over here tells us that she walked upright. Unfortunately, not with that one, because with this one, she actually walked like an ape. But he says this hip must be twisted. And if we twist it a little bit, then she could walk upright. Not with this one, but if we twist it, we could. And he says it must be a twisted hip. But of course, there is no other hip to compare it with. Can you see? So all we have is a hip that makes her walk like an ape. Now, why does he say it's twisted? Well, because of the knee. The knee, you see, is more like a human knee. That's the only piece of the fossil that is like a human. But do they tell you in the textbooks that they never found the knee with Lucy? That they found it in totally different deposits? That it doesn't even belong to this fossil? No. They just added it for convenience. Now remember, man and apes were contemporaneous, yes or no? So what's the big deal with finding a human knee? Because in this area, we find humans and Australopithecines together. In Olduvai Gorge, you find evidence of human activity as well as these creatures.
Now, what about the Big Bang theory? I find the Big Bang really quite fascinating. I mean, here you have all these highfalutin scientists, and they're saying that there was this gigantic explosion and everything came into perfect order. Now, these are the same scientists who go around touting the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, which says that things move toward a state of disorganization. So now you're going to have this big explosion and everything becomes perfectly organized. And when you ask them about it, they say, well, we can explain this based on probability theory. Because if there's enough big explosions over a long enough period of time, over billions and billions of years, one of them will be the perfect explosion. And I say, so what you're telling me is if I blow a hurricane through a junkyard enough times, over billions and billions of years, eventually after one of those hurricanes, there'll be a 747 fully loaded and ready to fly. Well, but I mean, it's even more ridiculous than that, because our solar system, not to mention the universe outside of that, is extraordinarily well organized to the point where we can predict 70 years away when a comet is coming. Now, that type of organization to just come out of an explosion, I mean, you want to talk about fairy tales. That is amazing. And then even if you want to use their own scientific theories, you know, you've got this mass spinning and then it explodes. In physics, we have something we call angular momentum, and it is preserved. So it should be preserved in any orbit of anything that is affected by gravity around a planet, which means everything has to traverse in the same direction. Well, it doesn't. There are many planets that have satellites and moons that go in opposite directions. So that doesn't work with angular momentum. And there are a whole series of things. What about all the debris from the billions and billions of explosions that were not perfect? Where's that? I mean, we should have been bombarded constantly by all this debris coming down. We're not seeing it. So, you know, there's a lot of things there that really require an enormous amount of faith. And really what it boils down to is, where do you want to put your faith? In man or in God? Which one makes more sense? And I constantly say, you know, I'm a person of limited faith. I really don't have enough faith to believe that stuff that they say. I mean, that is really beyond belief in terms of the number of coincidences that have to occur and the number of things that have to violate even their own principles in order for it to work.
Now, the story goes actually even further. From the Big Bang, you had an explosion. Originally, there was energy. Then a quark soup. These are subatomic particles. Eventually, the first atoms formed, although they never should have. They should have been destroyed by antimatter and matter coming together. And now you have hydrogen. The whole universe out there filled with hydrogen, perhaps a little bit of helium and some of the slightly bigger ones, but basically hydrogen. Now, what do we consist of? What elements are there in us? Everything from carbon to every single ion that you can imagine, the whole periodic table, we have it. Now, where do all those come from? If we all evolved naturalistically, where do all these other particles come from? If there was a vast gas cloud, it's consisting just of the very lightest of the gases. Well, science teaches that these compounds must have formed out there, or else they couldn't be there today, right? So how did it happen? Well, they reason that the gas clouds started to coalesce upon each other, and eventually forces within the system contracting through gravity, the various elements in upon each other, until you had the formation of stars. And in the stars, you would have nuclear fusion, creating all the other components, and then those stars explode with a supernova and put all that new material into the space. And then that gathers again into new systems, and eventually you have all the elements that you need. There are major problems with that. How do you get a gas that is expanding in a vast universe of space to come together under forces of gravity, mind you, which we do not see operating at that level, forming a star? That's a major problem. And then, to redefine it and eventually to have the raw materials to actually start an evolutionary process of naturalistic evolution until we can get the dawn of man. That's basically what is taught. So originally, there was just inorganic material. And this inorganic material gathered then on some planet, and on this planet of inorganic material, organic molecules formed spontaneously on this planet, and those organic molecules again came together fortuitously to form the molecules of life, and they in turn to form cells, and they in turn to form the other organisms on the planet. That's what we're taught. So basically, where does everything come from? Dust. Dust. And dust reconstructed itself through processes, naturalistic processes, to eventually form everything that we see today. So basically, you come from a rock. That's what is taught. That's what one has to believe. And one has to ask oneself the question, is this feasible, that dust eventually formed life, and life eventually formed the complex organisms and structures that we see in the world today? Is that feasible, all by itself, driven by a process which required natural selection? We'll be dealing with all of these issues. Now, science further teaches that once this process had started, then on our own planet, through various ages, which are characterized in millions of years, life came into existence, and the evolution of macroorganisms, that's everything that creeps and crawls and does whatever it does, took place in the last 600 million years. And there's a huge time scale which is thrust at us and say, there it is, you do with it whatever you deem fit.
You know, think about the beautiful flowers that we see. How are flowers able to reproduce? Pollination. How does pollination occur? Bees and other creatures. Now, according to evolution, plants came along before the bees. So, how do plants reproduce? And what about animals? And what about people and their reproduction? You know, it was a wonderful thing that God gave us. You know, men are attracted to women, women are attracted to men. Although that's changing in this society. But anyway, that was the way it was supposed to be, okay? And it was a beautiful thing. But according to evolutionary model, you know, we really came from an amoeba. And amoebas, they just like split, and then there's two amoebas. So it seems to me like according to the evolutionary model, you do things that are efficient. So rather than going out and looking for a mate, you would just divide, and there'd be two of you. And that'd be pretty horrible in some cases. But, you know, things are supposed to work in an efficient way. So according to the evolutionary model, we would be less pugilistic, and we'd be much more logical. We'd be much more creative. We wouldn't be going around fighting each other and cutting off people's heads anymore, because that stuff would have been extinguished and we would have evolved into something much better. According to the creation model, in which we have an adversary, it's very easy to explain. Why people act that way is because they have choice and because there is an adversary out there. So again, these are things where we're using that logic. We're looking at the two different points of view. How are things done? And we are the ones who get to make the choice.
Let's have a look at some of the criteria. Evolutionary processes require, number one, advancement from simple to complex. That would be logical, right? That's what evolution requires. Number two, Evolution requires development from small to large. That's called the law of Carroll. Carroll was a scientist who said everything had to start from small and develop to large. There is no other way. That's logical. Think about it. You don't start with a rhinoceros and end with an amoeba. You start with an amoeba and you develop all the way up to the rhinoceros. That would be logical. Is that correct? So that's a perfectly logical assumption that you would make if evolution was correct. And also, if life started somehow fortuitously somewhere on the planet, suddenly it was there, then there would have only been one. And eventually they could have become more and more and more and more and more if the theory is correct. So we start with low diversity to high diversity. That's logical. That's what you'd expect. But what do we have? No, we don't have that at all. We have irreducible complexity. Suddenly they're there. Boom. And some of the features in what we have cannot be simplified. They will not work if they are simplified. So they have to be complete. Everything has to be there. Boom. Some of the organelles and structures in living organisms are so complicated and need so many building blocks and parts that if they're not complete, they wouldn't work. So, boom, everything has to be there at the same time. So we don't have advancement from simple to complex. Everything was always complex. Do we have small to large? No. If we go into the past history, everything was bigger and larger and more magnificent than it is today. Today we have but a fraction of what used to exist in terms of size and in terms of diversity. We have reverse diversity. We would expect low to high, but we find far more creatures in the past than exist today. In fact, we only have a fraction left of what used to live. So we find exactly the opposite to what is to be expected. Well, that's a problem. S. Gould, in his article, Return to Hopeful Monsters in Natural History, now these are the top scientists. Stephen Jay Gould is dead now, but still, his work lives. The family trees that adorn our textbooks are based on inference. They come out of the mind, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. So Darwin's theory of this is what we would expect is logical if it were true. But we don't find that. We find exactly the opposite. And the family trees are based on inference. Now, if you have erosion, isn't this what happens? Yes or no? Doesn't erosion make valleys and ravines and things like that? Here are 3 layers taken in Africa on one of the mountain ranges there, the Cedarburg, very beautiful area. And look at them. There's one layer, there's another layer, and there's another layer on top. Let me give you another picture. There, on the left. Look at them carefully. A layer at the bottom. Now remember, what does science teach? This was once the surface of the earth. There's the contact between them. There's the next one. There's the contact between them. Now, millions of years later, there's the next one. That's now on top. So that's getting some erosion exposure. Can you see how nice and flat it is? Is it flat, yes or no? No. It looks like this. Up, down, down, whatever. Why? Because erosion washes it out like that. So now if I put another layer on top, let's say all this went under the ocean and I put another layer on top, would the contact be or would it be yep? What would it be? What do you say? It certainly wouldn't look like that. So do you think it's possible that that was never really the surface of the earth for a very long period of time? And that before you could say, Jack Robinson, the next layer was on top? Is it possible? But what would that do to the evolution theory? What would it do? It would create a great problem because these things happened over millions and millions of years with the same principles applying today, applying to the past. There will be a problem. Look at this. Here's a layer, 1, 2, 3. Everything in between is gone. Where is it? Well, they've been eroded away, obviously. All right, so if I put new layers on top, I certainly shouldn't get flat contacts, shouldn't look like that. Erosion will have it look like that, right or wrong? And if I put a layer on top, it should look like that, right or wrong? But it doesn't, it looks like this. All right, now let's think about this. Let's say this is the Grand Canyon, and the black is one layer, and the red is another layer, but I know there should be a yellow because it was found in another area. But it's not there in the Grand Canyon. So what does science teach? It was washed away by erosion. Is that right? And therefore, millions of years of time cannot be found there. But the contact is absolutely flat, and it shouldn't. It should look like that. So now, here's another possibility. In actual fact, this wasn't time at all. These are layers of mud. There's one layer of mud, a missing layer of mud, and a red layer of mud. Whereas here we have a black, a yellow, and a red layer. Let me explain this. I have 3 buckets of mud here in the front. One contains black mud, the other one yellow mud, and the other one red mud. Now, I take this huge bucket that I have of black mud, and I go whoosh, and I spread it all over this hole. And then I take my bucket of yellow mud, which happens to be a small bucket of mud, and I go whoosh, and I just spread the front here with my mud. And then I take another big bucket of red mud, and I go whoosh, and I spread it over the hole. Now I have, in the front here, eventually when it dries, I make a cut. How many layers have I got? 3. In the back there, I make a cut. How many layers have I got? 2. Aha! So in the back there, obviously what happened is millions of years of erosion took the middle layer away, right? Right? Or would you perhaps agree with me, I didn't have enough mud to get to the back? You see the difference in the philosophy? The one requires time, the other one talks about mud. Now, which one is right? The Bible says there was a flood, a worldwide flood. That's what the Bible says. Now, if that is true, you would expect a lot of mud on earth. And do we find a lot of mud on earth? Yes. Everything is mud. Marine sediments here on this earth. Where should they be? In the bottom of the ocean. There's not enough there to account for any of this time that has gone by. It's all sitting on land, which is all kind of upside down. Now, here are some scientific publications. 20 million years of weathering and erosion under varied conditions. And then he says, the survival of these paleoforms is in some degree an embarrassment to all the commonly accepted models of landscape development. Here's a scientist that says, you know, we have a problem. All of these mud layers are there, and erosion is taking place all the time, and look at what we have. Everything is still there. Actually, it should be gone several times over. Why is it still there? So we will be looking at this issue in the next section. For example, the outcrops were excellent, but even the closest inspection failed to turn up the precise position of the 15 million year gap. Why is there a gap and I cannot see it? These are questions that need answering. I want to take you all to a very exciting place. In many areas of the world, you have petrified forests. This is what a petrified tree looks like. That's a tree that has turned to stone. Now, in some areas of the world, you have some amazing features. Like if you go to Yellowstone National Park, for example, if you go to Mount Hornaday over there, you will find one layer of petrified forests, one on top of the other. And these trees are standing there in the upright position. Now, science has always taught that these trees stand like that because they grew there in the past. So this tells us that there were long periods of stability, so there could not have been a universal flood. In fact, these petrified trees were used to ridicule the model of a universal flood. So they literally stand there. They are huge. They look as if they grew there forever, but did they? The only difference between them and modern trees is they are stone, solid stone. And you have these layers. Interestingly, the layers are flat, one on top of the other. Now here's some interesting features. Here is one that stretches through more than one layer, but if you look at it, there are some interesting phenomena. Number one, there are no roots. The roots are ripped off. Number two, there's no bark. And if you look on the sides, they don't have any branches. Now, what science is saying is that these forests grew there, then there was an eruption of a volcano, ash came down and buried the forest. And then a new forest grew, and then there was an eruption and buried the forest. And then a new forest grew, and then there was an eruption and it buried the forest. 40, 45 times after each other, and now you have all these layers, over 40 layers of forests. But they're all flat, which is very strange. And some of them have upright trees, and they have horizontal trees in them. Now we're looking at these trees. If you dig them out, there you can see there's a flat one, and here are a whole lot of horizontal ones. There's one, there's one, there's one, there's one lying over there. And the interesting thing is they're all facing in the same direction. And this is weird. Did the trees then in the past always fall over in the same direction? So what you do is you measure it. So they went to all the various layers and found, well, in this layer, it's in that direction. And in the next one, in that direction, and that direction. So these layers of forests are orientated according to stream direction. If you take a modern forest, you don't pick up those patterns at all. So what happened? Something must have changed. Well, this is what it looks like today. Here are two layers which can be explained by science as constituting the forest floor. So when everything gets covered, at the bottom you have the forest floor. But this is very interesting because there are two forest floors just a hand's breadth apart. Are these two forests that were just a hand's breadth apart? That doesn't make much sense. Secondly, when you take this to the lab and you grind it down and you have a look, then you'll see that the material in it is water sorted. Ha! So did these forests form underwater? Because if you pick up a forest floor today, everything is jumbled up. A twig, a leaf, a twig, a leaf, a twig, a leaf, needles, pines, everything mixed up. But not here. Here it's water sorted. That's another interesting scenario. Here's a tree dug out. Notice that the roots are definitely ripped off. Now, if a forest grew and it got covered and the trees got buried upright, would the roots be ripped off, yes or no? No, doesn't make any sense. Notice the layering that we see over here. And here's another interesting thing. This is a turbidite flame. That's a mud flame. So this must have happened underwater. Now, a solution to this problem came when Mount St. Helens erupted. Here we still have a lot of volcanic material and geysers. And this was St. Helens before the eruption. Notice this beautiful glacier on the top. And when this first eruption came, then the water melted and rushed down the south side. There were two cycles of eruption. These were the lakes that surrounded the mountains. This is Spirit Lake with a glacier on top and the beautiful forests around. And then in 1980, the mountain erupted, not with an explosion. It just erupted and the ice melted on the top and formed this flood down the south side. Notice how the trees started to be ripped out, and notice that these trees don't have any branches on them as they float in the water. Then it was a great catastrophe. Everything was covered in mud. Houses were buried, all kinds of things. A month later, there was the huge eruption, which I'll talk about in a moment. But on the south side, this is what we see. Trees ripped out, and here they are. What do you notice? They are orientated in the direction of stream flow, and they have no branches, and their roots are ripped off. Here are some giant ones that were ripped out like that. And here you can see dents in the trees, because as the trees roll in the water, the branches are ripped off, and as they bash up against each other, the bark is stripped, and so these trees are without bark. They don't have any roots, and they don't have any branches. And if you look at the layering, it looks exactly like in the petrified forests. Then a month later, there was this earthquake, and the greatest landslide witnessed by modern man took place, and the top third of the mountain slid away and released huge pressure, and the mountain erupted. But notice that the eruption takes place to the north side. The south side is unaffected. So we have two sides of a story here. This is amazing stuff. And it explodes with a force of 500 Hiroshima atomic bombs. Boom. And puts enough debris up there to account for 1 ton of material for every person living on the planet. Cars are slung kilometers across the terrain. Huge trucks were transported kilometers across, and the forests were stripped bare and buried. This is what it looked like before the eruption, and that's what it looked like after the eruption. So this huge, massive material came and crashed into the lakes. Now you can imagine what that did to the water. What would that do if a huge amount of material just fell into a lake? Well, it would displace the lake. So there was huge tidal waves, just went, and they just rushed through the area, and they cut canyons, and they gathered the debris of wood and washed it back into the newly forming lakes as they formed. Here's a steam crater that formed. There's a human being standing over there as a scale. So hot material lands in the water, explodes, and forms that crater. Here's a canyon. This canyon formed in seconds when this water rushed through, and this material here was formed during this eruption. So all of this happened within a few minutes. And if they look at the layering, they would imagine that this must have taken millions of years of time, but it happened in a very short time period. Huge trees transported, ripped out, some of them sheared off by the blast as if cut by a blade, and transported many miles in these mud flows in the upright direction. Here's another one, transported upright in a flow direction. Huge quantities gathered in the lakes. This is Spirit Lake. Here are these things gathering, and then very soon, some of these trees started floating upright. Now, here's an interesting story. So they wanted to have a look. So down went the divers, and what did they find at the bottom? Huge quantities of bark. Thick, thick layers of bark. Did you know that some coal seams consist of nothing but bark? Inexplicable in a forest situation. Impossible to explain. Here it is. The bark settles down underneath, the logs float on the top. The brown coal that I showed you of the largest mine in the world consists of the logs, and some of the lower layers consist of nothing but bark. So here these trees float upright. Now what if there was another eruptive cycle and they were buried while they were floating upright and mud buried them from the side? How would they be buried? Upright. So they took a scanner and they measured how many trees there were in this lake, Spirit Lake, floating upright. And they found 19,000 trees. So if we go back to our petrified forests, you see all these layers of forests with upright and horizontal trees in them. And these could have formed rapidly. Now, one interesting thing that they did is they took samples from all across the column and sent it to the lab for analysis. And guess what they found? Each eruptive cycle today has a special chemical fingerprint. You see, as the magma forms under the volcano, it's new material. Well, when it blasts to the top, the chamber at the bottom is empty and has to fill up again, and the mountain is quiet until it has built up enough pressure for the next cycle. Now, today they know that if those cycles are more than 3 months apart, then the chemistry is different. Well, here, the chemistry at the bottom and at the top is exactly the same. So this tells us that the whole process couldn't have taken longer than 3 months. That fits beautifully into the story. We can also see why the trees are orientated, because obviously it happened in water. And even the upright trees are buried in a particular way. Not all trees are perfectly round. So let's say it has a big rootstock on the one side. It'll be orientated in the direction of stream flow. Now, if this was a local phenomenon just here in the United States, that would be one thing. But it's universal. This is Africa, the petrified forests, exactly the same scenario. They are stream orientated. They don't have any branches. They don't have any bark. They're all lying in the direction of stream flow. Their branches are ripped off. The exact same scenario is in Europe, in Australia, here on your continent, everywhere in the world, you find this. But surely it will take millions of years for that tree to turn into stone. Well, here are the amazing stone bears of Yorkshire. There's a little stream in Yorkshire which is high in silicon, which is what you would expect after a universal flood as well. And they come there and they hang their teddy bears in the water. And the time needed for that teddy bear to turn into solid stone depends on the size of the teddy bear. Larger porous items, large teddy bears, clothing, take 6 to 12 months. Non-porous items, such as the top hat of a fireman helmet, can take up to 18 months to be encased in solid stone. There they are, solid stone. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts and saying, where is this promise of his coming? Ever since our fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Everything continues as it was always. That's the law of uniformitarian thinking. The past must be explained by the present. For this they are willingly ignorant of. Now let's see what they don't want. That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water, and of the water, and in the water. So the creation account will be negated. They will be willingly ignorant that God created. Whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. What else will they deny? A worldwide flood. Does science do that? Science does all of these things. They deny creation. They deny a worldwide catastrophe. Why? But the heavens and the earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. The flood was God's judgment. Is that correct? Yeah. On a sinful world. And God says there will come a final judgment which won't be by water, but will be by fire. Now, if I don't want to be subject to a God, and I don't want to be subject to a judgment, then I have to deny the existence of God. And if God has left so much evidence for a previous judgment, which would enforce a subsequent judgment, then people might come to their senses. So why not deny a previous judgment, and you don't have to worry about a judgment that's going to come? Does that make sense? So the whole aspect of the Godhood and everything he stands for has to be denied. Why? Because they are willingly ignorant. They don't want a God. There is no room for a God in their formula. When I was an atheist, there was no room for God. God didn't exist. Don't believe that atheists don't believe in anything. Atheists believe everything. Anything. As long as it's not God. Right? That's what atheism is about. You'll find atheists in the New Age movement thinking that they themselves are God. Isn't that right? You will find them in the spiritistic world playing and all these kinds of things. And talking with spirit mediums, that's fine. Working with their spirits, but please, no God. So the issue tonight is, either God's word is true, and then what else it says in the Bible is also true, or it is not true. The choice is yours. You can belong to this group that says there was no creation, there was no flood, or you can believe that thy word is truth.
Well, first of all, I think it's quite evident from what you've seen tonight. It takes faith to believe in God. it takes faith to believe in evolution. I think it takes a lot more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in God. But they both require faith. And the fact of the matter is, they're both religion. And if we really were to put a litmus test on them, and we said we can't teach religion in school, we wouldn't be able to teach evolution either. But I think the most powerful evidence is the fact that we are creative. The fact that we are compassionate. And the fact that we can manifest love. Where did that come from? In the evolutionary model. Why is it somebody's drowning? For the most part, you're not just going to walk by. You're going to try to throw them something. If you can swim, you're going to jump in and save. That doesn't work in the evolutionary model. Because the evolutionary model says survival of the fittest. You would just say, do that and just keep walking. Now, some people do that. But, most people, they see somebody struggling. There's something inside of them that says, help. That makes no sense whatsoever in the evolutionary model. So we should be extraordinarily thankful for the example that has been given to us, for the fact that the creator of the universe, think about that power. Think about the expanse of the universe. It's mind-boggling whenever I start studying, the cosmos, and realize how tiny and insignificant we are. And yet, that he would send his only begotten Son to this place and all this magnitude, that the individual who created all this was willing to be spat upon, humiliated and crucified, tormented, because he loved us that much. That could happen on our behalves. And that we could manifest any doubt whatsoever would be pretty amazing. But I think we have all the evidence that we need, that we have a powerful, a loving God who will do anything for us except force us. Thank you very much.